The 2024 U.S. presidential contest has intersected with global affairs like no other election in recent history. The stakes are high as the United States, long the arbiter of deterrence and the democratic international order, finds itself struggling to lead on the global stage amid great power competition with China and Russia and evolving wars in Europe, the Mideast, Africa, and Asia. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at The Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series, we're joined by Peter Bergen, the renowned journalist, an author, and a leading voice here at the New America think tank in Washington. Peter is also the top national security analyst at CNN. He's written several prominent books, including The Cost of Chaos, the Trump Administration and the World in 2022, that went deep inside Donald Trump's foreign policy machine. His first book, Holy War, Inc., back in 2001, had a profound impact on me personally as a then aspiring war correspondent, as it told the harrowing story of Peter's historic interview with Osama bin Laden in the years prior to 9/11. Peter, thank you for joining me. Let's jump right into this by looking at how the past two administrations have shaped America's current position in the world. Many argue the first Donald Trump administration and the subsequent Biden-Harris administration were worlds apart on international issues. But you've written that Trump and Biden actually share surprising commonalities on foreign policy, on China specifically. Can you unpack that for me? What do you say to Republican hawks who argue that Biden has actually been much softer on China?
So the Trump administration, certainly in the national security strategy that was overseen by Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster in 2017, called out China in a way that previous administrations hadn't done so publicly. So, for instance, on the strategy said that the Chinese have stolen hundreds of millions of dollars of American intellectual property. They are the fastest growing military in the world, the only military that could possibly challenge the United States, called out their expansion in the South China Sea, etc. And that was a change in official American policy, because previous administrations had kind of hoped that a liberalizing China would emerge from a China that was getting richer. Quite the opposite happened. As China got more rich, it actually became more authoritarian, whether it was imprisoning 2 million Uyghurs and other ethnic groups in concentration camps, whether it was extinguishing democracy in Hong Kong. So the Trump administration ended that, basically that phase of American foreign policy. The Biden administration has basically continued that. The Biden administration kept the tariffs that Trump had put in place on Chinese goods, and in fact added additional tariffs. So, for instance, the Biden administration put 100% tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles. Biden also prevented the sale of anything to do with AI or quantum computing to China that could help their military.
Let's go to Vice President Harris, and she's widely characterized in a lot of U.S. media to have very little foreign policy experience, and what experience she does have is hitched to her time as vice president under Biden.
Right.
Would her foreign policy, and on China specifically, be a continuation of Biden? Or?
Well, I think her foreign policy probably would be a continuation of Biden on almost any issue. I think her tone on Gaza is different from Biden. Would that be?
In what way?
Her tone, she tends to emphasize Palestinian suffering as much as she emphasizes October 7th and the attack on Israel. That seems tonally different from Biden. She also met separately with Netanyahu when he was here in the United States a few weeks ago, which is kind of unusual for a vice president to meet separately with the head of another country without the president being present. What happened during that meeting, who knows? But she could take a different tone. What that means in terms of policy, I don't know. Biden has given Netanyahu basically a blank check. He keeps saying to Netanyahu versions of, you should exercise restraint, and then he also says, we've got your back. And there was actually a very interesting piece in I think the Washington Post about a debate in the Pentagon, which is, if we're there's no cost to Israel doing anything in the region if they know that there is a American battleship in the region and essentially they get to, it's what economists call moral hazard, right? Which is they get to do whatever the hell they want under an American national security umbrella that they can depend on. Even though the state of American policies, we don't want a larger regional war. Well, right now we are in a larger regional war.
I mean, Israel's war is against Iran-backed proxies, very different proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. But how do you see this changing going forward? And what can the U.S. do, regardless of who's in the White House in 2025, to stave off an expanding conflict with Iran?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the United States and Israel are in a war with Iran through these Iranian proxies. Iran doesn't want a full-scale war with either Israel or the United States. Israel may conclude, I think right now we're in I think Netanyahu knows he has a window where he can do whatever the hell he wants, because we're in election season and no candidate is going to say to Israel, you need to show restraint, because it's politically not a desirable message during an election season. So I think that Netanyahu has a free hand and is going to do, Biden has said you shouldn't attack Iranian nuclear facilities. That seems like a pretty low bar in terms of telling, that's our red line. And clearly Israel is going to respond in some way and attack Iranian oil facilities. And maybe they will decide that this is the time, if there's ever a time to do it, to take out Iranian nuclear facilities. I don't know how effective that would be. These facilities are very much buried. I also don't know that, if you took them out, it's not like you take out the knowledge of how to build these things that exist.
Would Israel garner some support, perhaps, from Arab allies, Saudi Arabia and others?
I think there'd be a lot of people publicly saying maybe, this is terrible, but privately saying this is great.
Is that something that Trump is more likely to capitalize on geopolitically than Harris?
I don't know. I mean, I think Trump has a problem with Netanyahu personally, which is something to do with the Soleimani assassination, which was ordered by Trump in Baghdad, the leader of the Quds force in Iran. Trump has some beef about Netanyahu not helping him on that. So since everything with Trump is very personal, Netanyahu may not get the blank check from Trump that Netanyahu seems to assume that he is going to get.
Let's look a little bit at the current state of global jihadist terrorism. After the Afghanistan withdrawal, the Taliban takes control again. Given your unique breadth of experience with understanding Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, how big of a threat is it now that there's a global external attack capacity emanating out of Afghanistan with ISIS or an AQ element?
Well, ISIS-K did kill 145 people in Moscow at this concert venue in March. ISIS, its spy group, was planning to attack a Taylor Swift concert in Austria, and that was only averted because the CIA told Austrian authorities that it was going to happen. A German ISIS recruit killed 3 people with a knife in a German city in the same month. We just had the arrest in the United States of an Afghan who was recruited by ISIS and was planning to carry out an attack on election day. And there's also been U.S. military operations against ISIS targets in Iraq recently. So there seems to be a mini ISIS resurgence. Now, is that a big deal compared to when ISIS controlled territory the size of Great Britain and population the size of Bulgaria? No. But it is something. And the United States is in the middle of negotiating a pullout from Iraq, which we did in 2011. Then we went back in 2014. Now we're going to pull out again. Now, the exact details of this agreement, there's some public sort of discussion of what the agreement actually is. The Biden administration is negotiating this right now. Whether it's Harris or Trump, might this box them in some way to withdraw from Iraq in a way that wouldn't be that smart? I don't know. I mean, The other thing is Iraqi politicians have a desire to be able to say, well, the Americans are leaving. A Democrat or a Trump administration also might have a desire to say, well, the war is over, we should leave, or we are leaving. But that certainly isn't a bad thing for ISIS if the United States is not in Iraq.
How does this phenomena with a mini ISIS resurgence intersect with this other war in the Middle East? And this question of after these, if you look at the post 9/11 era from a 20-year standpoint, there were successes in dismantling Al-Qaeda's global the leadership network, crushing the ISIS caliphate. This campaign that we've seen that's sort of got a lot of propaganda around it on both sides, but the Israeli campaign in Gaza, are you concerned that this current dynamic could give rise to another generation of extremism and potentially rejuvenated jihadist global terrorism?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes, because obviously, Hezbollah and Hamas are not going to be destroyed, and Hezbollah is 30,000 man army with 20,000 in the reserves. Hezbollah is also a social movement. It has members of parliament. Hamas, smaller but similar in the sense it has governance capacity, and you killing a bunch of the leaders of these groups are not going to go away. They've been around. Hezbollah's been around for more than 4 decades. So, and there is a sort of October 7th effect on Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the sense that it sort of energized them, and it's a rallying cry. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think there is it radicalizes some people who are inclined to be radicalized. ISIS and Al-Qaeda certainly have tried to cash in on the October 7th Hamas attack. But Al-Qaeda remains a pretty small group, mostly in Afghanistan, although it has affiliates that are in Africa that are somewhat alive, and also in Somalia. Similarly with ISIS, or ISIS Central got kind of killed in Iraq and Syria, but it's obviously doing somewhat well in Afghanistan. And so, the jihadist movement is, I think, been damaged, as you pointed out, but the ideology continues, and there'll be some takers for the ideology for one reason or another going forward. Let's
look at Ukraine, and Kamala Harris has said she wouldn't meet with Vladimir Putin to engage in end of war negotiations unless Kiev was really directly involved. She's also really promoted the idea that Trump would cave to Putin somehow. What do you make of that? And does Harris, in your view, have a strategy for ending the war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it doesn't matter what the Americans say about Ukraine, because for the Ukrainians and the Russians to come to the negotiating table, I think is something that is going to be decided by the Ukrainians and the Russians. And the way that most wars are run, you either completely defeat the enemy, as the United States did with Japan in World War II, or you have a mutual recognition of a hurting stalemate, kind of a academic, which is basically both sides realize no one's winning. I look at South Korea, North Korea. The war didn't end between North Korea and South Korea. There's an armistice, and we have 25,000 American troops there still. So you could imagine at a certain point, the Ukrainians and the Russians say, it's a stalemate. Both of us are not winning, and let's have an armistice. And the United States could have a role in negotiating it, although actually the Chinese and the Indians could have a role, which might be more important. Certainly Modi is sort of try to present himself as a potential peacemaker.
So Trump has claimed that he would end the war before he takes the oath of office.
Which would be it actually would be illegal, because there's something called the Logan Act, and there's only one president at a time.
Right, okay.
So you're not allowed to, he wouldn't, until he's actually inaugurated, he can't negotiate this thing.
Interesting. But if we do look at his claim on its face, he would be coming at the presidency as a kind of second-term president with existing relationships with Modi.
Putin
and Xi Jinping, as well as some regional players that have relationships with Putin, specifically Viktor Orban. Could this result in some kind of momentum towards putting pressure on Putin to embrace an end of war negotiation?
And Zelensky. But Zelensky has, people. I mean, the Ukrainians have. I heard yesterday or 2 days ago, the estimates are 150,000 Russian dead and 400,000 wounded, and about half that for the Ukrainians. And their population is a quarter of the size of Russia. So, and both sides are taking tremendous, and it's a problem of sunk costs, right? If you're a businessman, you try and avoid okay, I sunk all these costs. It's not, I need to move on. But in a war, it's a bit different because people have died. And so for the Ukrainians, obviously they're having a hard time. The last time I checked, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier was 40.
I think the Russian side is also having a hard time. They're recruiting soldiers from various points around the region, luring them into Russia.
And they're paying them enough money if they come from some very remote.
We've now had reports of a couple of North Koreans being killed inside Ukraine, fighting on the Russian side.
So, I mean, Stalin said quantity has a certain quality of its own, and the quantity equation favors the Russians. But the Ukrainians, it may be hard for Zelensky to go to the negotiating table with all the blood and treasure that the Ukrainians have expended. So he has to be sort of thinking about people on the nationalist side of his equation. And I think, Trump sees himself as the great negotiator. Whether he is the great negotiator is a separate question. I think he'd like to. One thing that seems to be really true is that he doesn't like a lot of bloodshed. And he didn't get the United States in other wars. He did set up the withdrawal agreement with the Taliban. I think it went very poorly. But that seems to be his natural instinct.
You wrote in your 2022 book, The Cost of Chaos, the Trump Administration in the World, you wrote quite a bit about Trump's obsession with the so-called deep state. You argue that if there is a real deep state, it's not so much one agency or one group of people as just the national security community in Washington itself, and sort of the deep-rootedness of the hierarchy within that. You contend that Trump was basically at war with this definition of the deep state throughout his first presidency. How do you predict that dynamic will play out in a second?
Well,
Trump
we do have.
presidency?
I mean, despite the fact that Trump has disassociated himself from the 2025 Heritage Project, that is a 850-page document, and according to CNN reporting, 140 people that worked for Trump were in some way associated with writing, promoting, or whatever. It's a Trump project. And I think the reason that Trump disassociated himself from it is that he knows abortion is really a problem for him politically, and it's a very particular part of this document that he's trying to disassociate himself from.
Why does the document matter?
The 2025 plan has this federal abortion kind of plank that he doesn't like. But in that, the fact is there is a plan, and on the national security side, it's to get rid of a bunch of people at the State Department and a bunch of people in the intelligence community and make them all political appointees. And the State Department is perfectly reasonable to put in political appointees in quite a number of the senior positions. That's the way any president does it. In the intelligence community, actually, that is not the way it's done, because the intelligence community is supposed to present the bad news or the news the president, he or she, doesn't want to hear.
And not so much policy recommendations.
It's not intelligence. It's like, here's what you need to know. And so the CIA director typically doesn't go there with a bunch of political appointees. He or she goes in, they go there by themselves. The building itself, the CIA does not, they're providing the best possible intelligence to policymakers. They're not advocating for a policy. So if you put a bunch of political appointees all over the intelligence community because they're loyal to President Trump, they're going to say to Trump what he wants to hear. That is not the way. That's not very useful, actually. Even if you want to hear what you want to hear.
So do you envision almost a kind of war between the intelligence community establishment?
If they go through with the plan, I think that they'll try and make a bunch of the senior positions in the intelligence community to be political. It's perfectly fine for the office of for the director of national intelligence to be a political appointee. But if you made, let's say, several hundred of the senior positions all political appointees, it would kind of really sabotage the whole point of the intelligence community. Because, and so the theory of the case in Project 2025 is the intelligence community is this sort of bunch of pinko liberals, and they're kind of telling they're kind of undermining, they're not really giving their full story, and that's really not true. Now the counter argument is there are all sorts of legal protections for career civil servants, rightly so. It's very hard to fire a bunch of them, career foreign service officers, career civil servants, people who've worked in the intelligence community for 20 years. For good reason, it's hard to fire them. So I think there would be a bunch of legal battles if indeed there was, an attempt to replace a bunch of the intelligence community with Trump loyalists. I don't think it would be that easy to do. I also don't think it would be that smart.
Peter Bergen, so insightful, so interesting. Thank you very much for joining me on this edition of the Threat Status Influencer Series. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.